The rain pounded relentlessly against the city streets, casting a gray haze over the windows of the near-empty bus. Nurse Grace pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped aboard, shaking the cold droplets from her umbrella. The faint hum of the engine was accompanied by the occasional creak of the bus as it made its rounds, but the silence inside was almost eerie. Most passengers had already reached their destinations, leaving only a handful scattered across the dimly lit seats. As Grace moved toward the middle of the bus, her eyes caught sight of a small figure slumped in the farthest corner. It was a child, no older than 7, huddled motionless, his small frame partially obscured by a soaked hoodie. A chill ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from the unsettling stillness of the boy. She hesitated for a brief moment before her instincts as a nurse took over. "Excuse me," she called to the bus driver, her voice cutting through the muffled roar of the rain. "There's a child back here. He's not moving." The driver, a tired man with a face weathered by years of routine, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Should I call someone?" he asked, his tone cautious but concerned. "There's no time," Grace replied, already moving to the boy's side. His skin was pale, his clothes clinging to his frail body from the rain that must have soaked him before he boarded. Gently, she pressed 2 fingers to his neck, relieved to feel a faint but unsteady pulse. "I'll take him to the clinic myself," she said, determination tightening her voice. The bus driver nodded, sensing the urgency, and brought the vehicle to a halt. Without another word, Grace scooped the boy into her arms, his lightness startling her. He was far too fragile, as if he might shatter if she wasn't careful. Stepping off the bus, the rain greeted her with renewed ferocity. She tightened her grip around the boy, shielding him from the cold as she hurried down the slick sidewalk. Each step felt heavier than the last, her thoughts racing with unanswered questions. Who was this child? Why was he alone? And what could have left him in such a desperate state? The faint glow of the clinic sign came into view through the storm, its warmth promising sanctuary. Grace pressed forward, her heart pounding, not just from the exertion, but from an inexplicable sense of dread that clung to her like the rain-soaked air. Whatever this boy had endured, it was clear that his story was only beginning, and Grace knew she had just stepped into the heart of it. The clinic's sliding doors opened with a soft hiss, releasing a burst of warm, sterile air that sharply contrasted with the icy rain outside. Nurse Grace rushed in, the unconscious boy cradled tightly in her arms. Her soaked shoes squeaked against the polished tile floor as she made her way to the reception desk. "Grace? What happened?" Hannah, the receptionist, stood up abruptly, her eyes widening as she took in the sight before her. "I found him on the bus," Grace said breathlessly, her voice tinged with urgency. "He's unconscious, cold to the touch, and his pulse is weak. We need Dr. Adams now." Hannah wasted no time, picking up the phone and paging the doctor with a practiced efficiency. Grace could barely hear the announcement over the pounding of her own heartbeat. She looked down at the boy in her arms, his face unnervingly still, his lips tinged with the faintest blue. The rainwater had soaked through his clothes, leaving damp patches on her uniform. Every detail of his appearance struck her, a faint bruise on his temple, the fragility of his frame, and a troubling stillness that made her hold him tighter. Moments later, Dr. Adams appeared, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to immediate concern. "Bring him in here," he instructed, gesturing toward the nearest examination room. His calm but commanding tone steadied Grace, and she followed without hesitation. Inside the room, Dr. Adams cleared the table with a swift motion and nodded for Grace to place the boy down. His tall, composed figure moved efficiently, the practiced ease of years in emergency care evident in every action. Grace stepped back, folding her arms tightly across her chest, as if bracing herself for what might come next. "Vitals are weak," Dr. Adams murmured, leaning over the child with a stethoscope. "But he's breathing. Grace, we need IN4. Let's get fluids into him right away." Nodding, Grace sprang into action. Her hands moved deftly, retrieving the necessary equipment, but her mind refused to quiet. Who was this child? Where had he come from? And, more troublingly, why was he alone? As she inserted the 4, She couldn't ignore the sharp contrast between the boy's fragile appearance and the harsh, sterile surroundings of the clinic. As Dr. Adams continued his examination, he frowned slightly, running his fingers along the boy's wrist. No injuries aside from this bruise on his temple, but he's severely dehydrated and likely hypothermic. Grace, let's monitor his oxygen levels and stabilize him first. We'll run blood work once he's more stable. Grace nodded, but her attention was drawn to something else, a small, crumpled piece of paper sticking out of the boy's jacket pocket. Hesitating for only a moment, she carefully pulled it free, the dampness of the fabric clinging to her fingers. Unfolding it revealed faint, jagged writing. "Protect him. They're coming." Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the note, its cryptic message raising 1,000 questions. Without thinking, she handed it to Dr. Adams, whose brows furrowed as he read it. His usual calm demeanor took on a subtle edge of unease. "This complicates things," he said softly, his gaze meeting Grace's. "This isn't just a lost child. Someone is after him." Just as Grace absorbed the weight of Dr. Adams's words, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Officer Carter, a familiar figure at the clinic, entered the room. His presence, though steadying, carried an unmistakable sense of gravitas. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense demeanor softened only by the compassion in his eyes, he immediately assessed the situation. "Grace," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "I came as soon as I heard. What's going on?" Grace held up the note, her expression serious. "I found him on the bus, unconscious, alone, and this was in his pocket." Carter took the note, his jaw tightening as he read it. He glanced at the boy, still pale and motionless on the table, before turning back to Grace. "Do you have any idea who he is?" "No," Grace admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. "He didn't have any identification, and no one on the bus saw where he came from." Carter nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "We'll start with the bus company. Surveillance footage might tell us where he boarded and if anyone was with him. In the meantime, I'll have his photos sent out to local precincts. Someone must be looking for him." Grace felt a pang of sorrow as Carter snapped a picture of the boy. His face, so small and vulnerable, looked even more fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that whoever had written the note was already closing in. Dr. Adams broke the silence. "Officer, the child's condition is critical. We need to keep him here until he's stable, but you should also know this might not be a simple case of neglect or abandonment. That note suggests something larger." Carter's expression darkened. "I'll handle it. You focus on keeping him alive." As the hours ticked by, the clinic settled into a hushed rhythm. The storm outside began to subside, but inside, the tension only grew. Grace stayed by the boy's side, her mind swirling with questions. Who was this child? Why was he left on that bus? And most pressing of all, what kind of danger was he in? Late that night, as the clinic emptied and the quiet became almost suffocating, the boy stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and a faint, broken sound escaped his lips. Grace leaned in, her heart pounding with hope. "It's okay," she whispered, brushing a damp strand of hair from his forehead. "You're safe now." His eyes opened briefly, wide with fear and confusion. He seemed to search her face, as if looking for something, someone, to hold on to. Grace smiled gently, willing him to feel the safety she was trying to provide. But before she could say more, his eyes closed again, his fragile body succumbing to exhaustion. Grace sat back, her hand trembling slightly as she adjusted the foreline. This boy was more than a mystery. He was a promise, one she silently made to herself. Whatever danger awaited him, she wouldn't let it win. Not while she had breath in her body. And so, as the storm cleared outside, Grace remained steadfast. She knew the real storm was only beginning. The clinic had settled into an uneasy quiet. The hum of machines monitoring the boy's vitals punctuated the stillness, their rhythmic beeping a fragile reassurance that life still clung to his small body. Nurse Grace remained by his side, her eyes fixed on his pale face. She felt an unspoken bond growing with this child. A connection forged not by familiarity but by responsibility, by a sense of duty she couldn't ignore. Officer Carter returned after speaking with the bus driver and reviewing preliminary surveillance footage. His face, usually composed, bore traces of concern. "We've tracked where the boy boarded," he began, his voice low. It was a stop near the industrial district. The footage shows him walking onto the bus alone. No one followed him, and no one seemed to escort him. Grace frowned, her mind racing. How could a child his age wander into a place like that alone? He couldn't have just appeared there. Carter nodded grimly. Exactly. That part of the city isn't somewhere you'd expect a child, especially not at night. We're expanding our search, but so far, no reports of a missing boy matching his description. It's like he doesn't exist in any system. The weight of his words pressed on Grace's chest. She glanced at the boy's fragile frame, his innocence stark against the sterile clinic backdrop. If no one was looking for him, who was this child, and why did that note warn of danger? She reached into her pocket, running her fingers over the now-dried paper, as if hoping its cryptic message might somehow reveal more. "I'll stay in touch," Carter said, pulling her from her thoughts. "For now, keep a close eye on him. Whoever wrote that note might already know he's here." The thought sent a chill down Grace's spine. As Carter left, she turned her attention back to the boy, gently adjusting the blanket draped over him. It was then she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint scar running along his wrist. It wasn't the kind of mark a child usually carried, and it hinted at a history more harrowing than she could have imagined. The hours crept by, and the storm outside faded into the stillness of the early morning. Grace sat by the boy's side, her fingers brushing against his damp hair as she whispered softly, "You're safe now. Whatever happened, I won't let anyone hurt you again." Just as the first rays of dawn seeped through the clinic's windows, the boy stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes filled with confusion and fear. He looked around, his small body tensing as if bracing for an attack. "Shoo, it's okay," Grace whispered, leaning closer. "You're safe. My name is Grace. Can you tell me your name?" The boy's lips trembled, and for a moment, she thought he might speak. But instead, tears welled in his eyes, and he turned his face away, retreating into himself. "It's okay," she reassured him, her voice steady but kind. "You don't have to say anything now. Just rest." As the boy fell back into a restless sleep, Grace felt an ache in her chest. He wasn't just lost, he was terrified. And whatever had brought him here wasn't over. Later that morning, Grace found herself standing in the break room, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she tried to clear her head. Hannah entered, her expression as troubled as Grace felt. "I've been going through old case files, seeing if anyone matching his description has been reported missing in the past." "Nothing yet," she admitted, sinking into a chair. Grace nodded. Carter said the same thing. "It's like he came out of nowhere." Hannah tilted her head thoughtfully. "And that note? They're coming. What do you think it means?" Grace's grip tightened on the coffee cup. "It means whoever left him didn't just abandon him. They were trying to protect him. From what, though? That's the real question." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Dr. Adams entered, his face unreadable. "Grace, I need you to see something," he said simply. Following him back to the boy's room, Grace noticed a small pile of items collected from the boy's clothing, items she hadn't noticed in the chaos of the previous night. Among them was a worn keychain with a single key attached, an old button, and a folded photograph. Grace carefully picked up the photo, her heart lurching as she unfolded it. The image was faded, the colors washed out, but it was clear enough. The boy stood in front of a large house, his arms wrapped around a woman. Her face, though smiling, held a weariness that spoke volumes. "That must be his mother," Grace murmured, tracing the woman's face with her thumb. "But why isn't she here? What happened to her?" Dr. Adams nodded. "That's what we need to find out. I've sent a copy of the photo to Carter. If we can locate the house, it might lead us to some answers." Grace placed the photo back on the table and turned to the boy, who was now awake, though his gaze remained distant. Kneeling beside him, she spoke softly. "Noah, do you remember this picture? The house? The woman in it?" The boy hesitated, his small hands fidgeting with the blanket. That's my mom, he whispered, his voice barely audible. She told me to run. She said they were coming. Grace's heart broke at his words. The fear in his voice was palpable, raw echo of whatever horror had driven him into the night. Who's coming, Noah? She asked gently, but he shook his head, burying his face in his hands. We'll figure it out, Grace promised, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. We'll keep you safe. As the day wore on, Officer Carter called with an update. The house in the photo, it's in the outskirts of town, near the industrial district, he said. We've dispatched a unit to check it out, but Grace, you need to be ready for anything. This could get dangerous. Grace hung up the phone, her resolve hardening. Whatever danger surrounded Noah, she was in this now, deeply, irrevocably. And no matter what lay ahead, she would see it through. The boy's life, his safety, his future. It all depended on what they uncovered next. The tension in the clinic thickened as the day progressed. Grace lingered by Noah's side, watching his small frame rise and fall with each shallow breath. The photograph and the cryptic note haunted her thoughts. Who was Noah's mother, and what kind of danger had she faced to send her son away alone? By mid-afternoon, Officer Carter called again. We've reached the house in the photograph, he began, his voice edged with caution. It's abandoned, but we found signs someone left in a hurry, clothes, food wrappers, even a child's toy. It lines up with what Noah's said so far. Grace gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding. And his mother? Any sign of her? Carter hesitated. No sign of her yet, but we did find something else. His tone darkened, and Grace's stomach churned. There was another note, pinned to the wall inside the house. It said, "They won't stop. Keep him safe." Whoever wrote this knew exactly what they were up against. A shiver ran down Grace's spine. What now? We're bringing in a forensics team to sweep the place, Carter replied. In the meantime, you need to be vigilant. If these people are still after Noah, they might try to track him down. The thought unsettled Grace. She glanced toward Noah, who was quietly drawing in a sketchpad Hannah had brought him. He seemed momentarily at peace, but Grace knew the danger was far from over. Whatever threat was chasing him had already torn his life apart, and it wasn't finished yet. Determined, she turned her attention back to the phone. Keep me updated, Carter. And if there's anything I can do, anything, you let me know. You're already doing enough, he assured her. Just keep him safe. Grace hung up and walked over to Noah, crouching beside his bed. Hey, buddy, she said softly. What are you drawing? Noah held up his sketch, a simple drawing of the house in the photograph, with a figure standing at its door. It's my mom, he said quietly. She told me to wait for her, but I got scared and ran. Grace's heart ached at his words. She reached out, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. You were very brave, Noah, and we're going to find her. I promise. But as she spoke those words, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. What if they were already too late? The storm outside had long since passed, but inside the clinic, the tension felt heavier than ever. By evening, Officer Carter returned with new information. His face was grim as he entered the room where Grace and Dr. Adams were reviewing Noah's medical chart. We've identified a lead, he announced, his voice low. The house belonged to a woman named Emma Harper, Noah's mother. She's not listed in any recent records, but we found an old police report filed years ago. It involved a domestic dispute with a man named Victor Kane. He's a known criminal, connected to smuggling and trafficking. Grace's heart sank. Do you think he's the one after her? Carter nodded. It's possible. If she tried to leave him, she'd have every reason to fear retaliation. Dr. Adams frowned, his hands resting on the edge of the desk. But why send Noah away? Surely she knew the risk of leaving him alone. She probably thought it was safer than staying with her, Carter replied. And judging by the notes we found, she knew exactly how dangerous Kane could be. Grace's mind raced. She thought of Noah's scar, the bruise on his temple, and the fear etched into his every movement. So what now? She asked, her voice trembling with urgency. We can't just wait for him to come here. We won't, Carter assured her. We're working with federal agencies to track Kane down. But until then, we need to secure this clinic. If Kane's people find out Noah is here, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. As Carter left to coordinate with his team, Grace returned to Noah's room. He was curled up under the blanket, staring at the ceiling. She sat beside him, her presence offering a quiet reassurance. "Noah," she said softly, "do you remember Victor Kane?" The boy froze, his small hands clutching the blanket. Slowly, he nodded. "He was mean," he whispered. "He yelled at my mom and hit her. She told me to hide when he got mad." Grace's chest tightened. She fought to keep her voice steady as she asked, "Do you think he's the one your mom was running from?" Noah hesitated, then nodded again. "She said he'd hurt me if he found me." Grace felt a surge of protectiveness. She reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You're safe now, Noah. I won't let anyone hurt you." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Somewhere out there, danger was lurking, and it was only a matter of time before it came for them. The clinic felt like a fortress under siege. Security guards stationed by Officer Carter patrolled the hallways, and every door was checked and rechecked to ensure it was locked. Yet the sense of safety remained fragile. Grace couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at her, a feeling that the danger was closer than they realized. Late that evening, as the clinic's usual bustle quieted, the phone at the reception desk rang. Hannah answered, her cheerful professionalism dimming as she listened. "Grace," she called out, her voice tight. "It's Officer Carter. He says it's urgent." Grace hurried to the desk, her pulse quickening. Taking the phone, she heard Carter's voice, low and tense. "We've identified Kane's men. Surveillance shows them circling the area near the clinic. We believe they're looking for Noah." Grace's stomach dropped. "What do we do?" "We're sending reinforcements," Carter replied. "But you need to prepare for the worst. If they try to get in, don't hesitate to call me directly." Grace hung up and returned to Noah's room, her heart pounding. The boy was asleep, his small body curled under a blanket, clutching the stuffed bear Grace had given him earlier. She sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall. How could someone want to hurt such an innocent child? Dr. Adams entered quietly, his presence grounding her. "The guards are ready," he said. "If anyone tries to get in, they won't get far." Grace nodded but couldn't shake her fear. "This isn't just about keeping Noah safe, is it?" she murmured. "It's about finding his mother. She's the key to all of this." Dr. Adams placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And we will find her. But for now, let's focus on what we can control." As the night deepened, Grace stayed with Noah, her determination hardening. Whoever Kane was, whatever power he wielded, she wouldn't let him destroy this boy's life. The next morning, the clinic was tense with anticipation. Officer Carter arrived with new information, his expression grim. "We've tracked down a possible location for Emma Harper," he said. A witness reported seeing a woman matching her description at a rundown motel outside town. Grace straightened, hope flaring within her. "Is she safe?" "We don't know yet," Carter admitted. "The area is known for criminal activity, and Kane's men have been spotted nearby. We're planning a raid, but it's risky. If she's there, we need to move fast." "I want to go," Grace said without hesitation. Dr. Adams turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Grace, you're not law enforcement. This could be dangerous." "I'm the only one Noah trusts," she argued. "If his mother is there, she'll need someone she can turn to." "Please, I have to do this." Carter hesitated, but finally nodded. "You can come, but you stay behind until the area is secure." The drive to the motel was tense. Grace sat in the back of the unmarked police car, her hands clenched in her lap. The city blurred past, each street a reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows. As they approached the motel, Carter spoke into his radio, coordinating with his team. The motel was as grim as Grace imagined. Its faded sign flickered weakly, and the building itself was a crumbling relic. Police cars surrounded the perimeter, their lights casting an eerie glow. Carter led the team inside, moving swiftly but cautiously. Grace stayed back, her heart pounding as she waited for news. Minutes felt like hours. Then, a voice crackled over Carter's radio. "We found her. Room 12. Carter gestured for Grace to follow as they moved toward the room. Inside, they found Emma Harper, her face pale, her eyes sunken with exhaustion, but alive. She flinched as the door opened, her body tensing with fear. "It's okay," Grace said softly, stepping forward. "We're here to help. Noah is safe." At the mention of her son, Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Noah? He's alive," she whispered, her voice trembling. Grace nodded, her heart breaking at the raw emotion in Emma's face. "Yes," Grace said gently. "He's been asking for you. We've been keeping him safe." Emma collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face as she wept. Grace knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You're safe now," she said, "but we need to know everything. Who's after you? Why did you send Noah away?" Emma took a shuddering breath, her voice barely audible. "Victor Kane," she said. "I tried to leave him, but he found out. He threatened to kill Noah if I didn't cooperate. Sending him away was the only way to protect him." Grace's chest tightened. "What does he want from you?" Emma hesitated, then whispered, "I know too much about his operations, his contacts, things that could destroy him." Carter leaned in, his expression grave. "Then we'll make sure he never gets to you. But we need your help to bring him down." Emma nodded, her fear giving way to resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes." Back at the clinic, Noah sat in the playroom Grace had set up for him, surrounded by crayons and toys. But even with the cheerful distractions, his face remained tense, his small shoulders hunched as though bracing for bad news. Grace returned from the motel with Emma, her presence bringing an air of relief and urgency to the clinic. As soon as Noah saw his mother enter the room, his eyes widened, and he ran into her arms. "Mommy!" he cried, his voice trembling with relief. Emma knelt, wrapping him in a protective embrace, her tears soaking into his hair. "You're safe now, baby," she whispered, rocking him gently. "I'll never let anything happen to you again." Grace watched from the doorway, her chest tightening at the raw emotion of their reunion. She didn't want to interrupt, but there was little time to waste. After a few moments, she approached cautiously. "Emma, Noah, I hate to rush this, but we need to talk. Officer Carter is waiting." Emma nodded, pulling herself together. She kissed Noah's forehead and whispered, "I'll be back soon. Okay? Stay with Miss Grace. She'll take care of you." Noah clung to her briefly before letting go, his eyes filled with silent trust as he looked at Grace. "You'll keep her safe?" he asked quietly. Grace crouched beside him, meeting his gaze. "I promise, Noah. We're all going to be safe." In a private room, Officer Carter laid out the details of the operation. "Emma, your testimony is critical," he said, his tone firm but reassuring. "But Kane is a dangerous man. He'll stop at nothing to silence you." Emma nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know. That's why I ran." "We've already started dismantling his network," Carter continued. "The information from the house and your motel room gave us leads. But we need more to finish the job." Emma hesitated, then spoke with quiet determination. "He has a warehouse on the edge of the city. It's where he keeps his records, his proof of everything. That's why he's so desperate to find me. I know where it is." Carter's eyes narrowed. "If we can get inside that warehouse, we can bring him down for good. But it won't be easy. He's bound to have it heavily guarded." Grace, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "You'll need someone who can go unnoticed. Someone who doesn't look like law enforcement." Carter shot her a sharp look. "Grace, this isn't your fight." "It is now," she replied firmly. "Noah's safety depends on this. I'm not just going to sit back and watch." Emma reached out, placing a hand over Grace's. "If she's willing to help, I trust her," she said. "She's the only one who's been there for us." Reluctantly, Carter agreed. "Fine, but you follow my lead, Grace. One wrong move, and this could go sideways fast." The night was moonless, the city's outskirts cloaked in shadow as Carter's team approached the warehouse. Grace rode in the back of an unmarked van, her nerves fraying with every bump in the road. Emma's directions had been precise, and now they were here, at the heart of Kane's operation. Carter handed Grace a small earpiece. You're going in as a clinic volunteer, he said. Your job is to distract the guards while we find a way inside. Stay calm, and don't do anything to draw attention to yourself. Grace swallowed hard, nodding. I can do this. The plan began smoothly. Grace approached the warehouse, feigning confidence as she spoke to the guards at the gate. I'm here to deliver medical supplies, she said, holding up a hastily prepared box of bandages and syringes. The guards exchanged skeptical glances, but waved her through. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and shelves, the air heavy with the scent of oil and damp wood. Grace kept her movements deliberate, her eyes scanning for anything that might hint at the location of Kane's records. Meanwhile, Carter's team moved into position. Through her earpiece, she heard his calm instructions. Grace, you're doing great. Keep moving. We're almost in. As she turned a corner, her breath caught. A small office was tucked away at the back of the warehouse, its door slightly ajar. She glimpsed a desk covered in papers and a laptop glowing faintly in the darkness. I think I've found something, she whispered into the earpiece. Good, Carter replied. Stay there. We're coming to secure it. But before Grace could move, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. She spun around to face a man with cold, calculating eyes, Victor Kane. Well, he said, his voice dripping with menace. What's a clinic nurse doing in my warehouse? Grace's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm just here to drop off supplies, she said, trying to sound casual. Your guards let me in. Kane's gaze hardened. I don't think so. You're too curious for a simple delivery girl. Before he could say more, the sound of gunfire erupted from outside. Carter's team had breached the warehouse. Kane's men scattered, shouting orders as chaos descended. Seizing the moment, Grace shoved Kane away and bolted toward the office. Inside, she grabbed as many files as she could, shoving them into her bag. Carter's voice crackled in her earpiece. Grace, get out of there. We've got this. She sprinted toward the exit, ducking behind crates as bullets flew overhead. Just as she reached the van, Carter pulled her inside, slamming the door shut. Are you okay? He asked, his voice laced with worry. I've got the files, she panted. Everything we need. The evidence Grace recovered was a goldmine. Stacks of documents, encrypted files, and even video footage from the warehouse tied Victor Kane to a sprawling network of illegal operations. Officer Carter wasted no time organizing a multi-agency task force. Within hours, the authorities secured warrants, raided Kane's safe houses, and arrested several of his associates. The net was closing in, but Kane himself remained at large. At the clinic, Emma stayed with Noah, the tension visible in her every movement. Grace sat with them in the quiet room, doing her best to reassure them both. The evidence will hold, she said softly, more for her own sake than theirs. It's over for him. Emma nodded, though her fingers trembled as she smoothed Noah's hair. He's always been one step ahead, she murmured. Even when I thought I was safe, he'd find a way to remind me he was watching. Noah, sensing his mother's unease, clung to her tightly. You're here now, Grace interjected, her tone firm. And we're not letting him near either of you. Hours later, Carter arrived at the clinic, his expression one of grim satisfaction. We've located Kane, he announced. He's holed up in a remote cabin outside the city. We're moving in tonight. Grace stood, her pulse quickening. What about Emma and Noah? Will they be safe? They'll stay here under guard until it's over, Carter assured her. This ends tonight. As Carter and his team prepared for the raid, Grace remained at the clinic, unwilling to leave Emma and Noah's side. The minutes dragged like hours, the weight of anticipation suffocating. Finally, just before midnight, Carter called. It's done, he said simply. Kane is in custody. The relief was palpable. Emma collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face as Noah clutched her hand. Grace felt a surge of pride and gratitude, not just for Carter and his team, but for the resilience of this family that had endured so much. Kane will never hurt you again, Grace said, her voice firm with conviction. It's over. With Kane behind bars, Emma and Noah were finally free to begin rebuilding their lives. The clinic became a safe haven for them in the days that followed. a place where they could process their trauma and rediscover a sense of normalcy. Grace remained a constant presence, her bond with them deepening as she watched their healing unfold. One afternoon, Emma approached Grace in the clinic's small garden. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You saved my son's life. You saved my life." Grace shook her head, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't have to thank me. You're the one who fought to protect him. I just helped." Emma reached out, taking Grace's hands in hers. "You did more than help. You gave us hope when we thought we had none." Inside the clinic, Noah worked on a drawing at a small table. His crayons danced across the page, creating a vibrant image of a house surrounded by trees, a safe, happy place. When he finished, he held it up proudly for Grace to see. "It's for you," he said with a shy smile. Grace knelt beside him, taking the drawing as her heart swelled. "Thank you, Noah. It's beautiful." He leaned in, whispering, "You're my hero." Weeks turned into months, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. Emma and Noah moved into a modest house nearby, close enough for Grace to visit often. With Kane's network dismantled, Emma found a job and enrolled Noah in school, determined to give him the stability he deserved. One bright morning, Grace arrived at their house with a box of muffins, greeted by Noah's excited hug and Emma's warm smile. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and the scent of freshly brewed coffee, a stark contrast to the fear and chaos that had once defined their lives. As they sat together around the kitchen table, Emma spoke quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. "We wouldn't be here without you, Grace." Grace smiled, shaking her head. "You're stronger than you realize, Emma. You would have found a way." "But we didn't have to do it alone," Emma said, her eyes shining. "Because of you." Grace looked at Noah, now chatting animatedly about his school projects, and felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was why she had become a nurse. Not just to heal bodies, but to restore hope and help people reclaim their lives. That evening, as Grace walked home, the city lights twinkled around her, casting a warm glow over the streets. She thought about the journey she had taken with Emma and Noah, the danger they had faced, the sacrifices they had made, and the bond they had forged. It had been one of the most challenging experiences of her life, but also one of the most rewarding. As she reached her door, she paused to look up at the sky, a sense of peace washing over her. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more lives in need of saving. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply feel grateful for the courage of a mother, the resilience of a child, and the unwavering power of hope. And as she stepped inside, Grace carried with her the quiet knowledge that she had made a difference, not just for Emma and Noah, but for herself as well.